So I'm going to start out by acknowledging some people in the crowd that are very important to me. Yasu Odisea, Yasu Stella, Yaya Papu, and Yasu Kumbare. And of course, Wifey Poo. Yeah, Greg and I go way back, and you probably gathered that from the inspired introduction of me he just gave. I have a little bit of a disadvantage here in that I just served on a panel that covers some similar subject matter that I intend to touch on in my talk here. But the subject matter of my talk is innovation as a driver of global economic strength. And what I want to touch upon is a couple of things. The connection between innovation and global dominance. Some of the things that we can learn about what's happened in the States, some observations about the US innovation economy, and what observations about that we can take back to Greece into something that's constructive and so forth. One interesting dynamic that's going on now that's not particularly well known in this country, but it's better known elsewhere, is that there's a transition from the old Soviet-style arms race into a new global arms race, and it's a global innovation arms race. We've had several shots against this country issued by various other countries. China, for example, has basically bought the manufacturing industry, a large part of the American manufacturing base from us. Taiwan bought the semiconductor space from us. We have several times innovated our way back to gaining the global dominance that we've had, but there's not a well understood recognition in this country that what's happening is global and that what's happening is premeditated on a government against government level and not just a per company, per VC, per startup basis. So I'll leave it at that because that's a subject that one could go on quite a bit about. So why is innovation worth the fight? Why is China developing 25-year innovation strategies? Why are countries like Korea and so forth doing these sorts of things? Because innovation, the reason is that the cat is out of the bag. People in other countries perhaps understand our history and the connection of innovation to this country's global economic strength better than we do. And we seem to be, this country has forgotten a little bit what's gotten us to the spot that we are, in part because of some of this free market and anti-government fervor that's gripping the nation. So just a few statistics to give a sense of the economic significance of innovation. If you took the startup companies that came out of MIT and you rolled them up into a country, that country would have the 12th largest economy in the world, okay? 12th largest economy in the world. One college, MIT is pretty good, but you're talking about a $600 million a year annual R&D budget. So that's a pretty good return. Another point, the internet. The internet adds $2 trillion, I'm sorry, between $1 and $2 trillion on an annual basis to the United States GDP. If you take that down to US citizens, that's $6,500 per US citizen, which is more than 10% of the median family income. So it's no wonder that other countries are observing this, right? Observing American global leadership and innovation, saying, we want a piece of that game. Right now, in one way, it's trivial and obvious that innovation is important, right? If you go back to the US and the Soviet Cold War days, so the battle there was, again, around technology, again, around innovation, but it was all about who can create the best arms, right? So that's a race that obviously, people know history. The US won that race. The battle now has sort of shifted onto other terms. So that's why innovation matters. So I want to talk a little bit about why this is a global matter, because the common, and we talked about this a little bit in the panel earlier, that innovation is intrinsically about people and that human capital does matter. innovations about venture capital, innovations about startups. If you look at all the truly groundbreaking technologies that have come to pass over the past several years, all of them have two things in common. One of them is that they received massive, massive subsidies from the United States government. Okay? Everyone knows about the private sector side, right? People don't recognize the role that the government, the United States government, has played in getting these things launched, right? The internet would not have been launched if it were completely up to the private sector to do it, because you wouldn't have had the return on the investment, right? So you go down the list. It's the internet, the microprocessor, the semiconductor, communication satellite, and wireless communication. All of these started by the original funding coming from the US government. All of it happened here, okay? Why has it always happened here? Well, one is obviously the massive funding that it's received. Another thing, though, is the interesting interplay between the public and the private sectors that occurs in this country. So obviously the Soviet Union had put in a massive R&D budget, spent a lot comparable to us over the Cold War period. What they did not have is the private sector participating and collaborating with the private sector, with the public sector in a productive way, the way we had here. So if you look at the internet started basically as a military science project that received lots of funding, transitioned over into the National Science Foundation, and then with some of Al Gore's help, went into the private sector. Now, the private sector has put massive funding into the internet, right? But the combination of the two is what's commonly attributed to why the US won the Cold War. So that's a sense in which innovation really is a global driver of economic strength. So if you're an American, here's one bit of good news. Despite all the bad news that we hear all the time, it is unquestioned that America is the global leader in innovation, hands down. Want to talk about China? Let's talk about China. The National Science Foundation, which is the organization that I work with, single-handedly, which is a $6 billion a year agency, has more Nobel Prizes than China has had in its entire history, okay? In fact, it has more Nobel Prizes than China and India have combined in their entire histories. And you take the whole emerging market, Brazil, Russia, India, China. This one relatively small United States foundation has more Nobel Prizes than all of them combined. Okay. So why is China eating our lunch right now? It's an important point to make because I think it's instructive about what we're doing here. And I think it says a little bit about what can be done in Greece. China's eating our lunch despite the free market fervor, despite the anti-government fervor that you sort of see in the mainstream media these days, in large part because of clever policy making by the Chinese. It's not the cheap labor, and it's not the R&D. The R&D, they're nowhere near us. They have cheap labor, but the Germans don't, and they still do just fine in manufacturing. What the Chinese are doing, there are two pieces of this, and I won't sort of belabor the point. One piece is this phenomenon of invented here and built there. So an American startup, coming out of a university, research lab, will come up with some fundamental breakthrough, right? So in the companies I deal with, what you see almost instantaneously is that they will say, okay, we've got this great invention. How do we get to China so we get this thing built? That's not a coincidence. Why is it that that's happened? Why has that mindset taken hold? It's not because China is the best manufacturer in the world, because they're not. We still are. This country is still the #1 manufacturer in the world. So there's a mindset issue that has to change here as well, right? And then there's also the whole state capitalism game. So China and much of Asia, and even smaller countries, are saying, you know what, we want to dominate in one particular industry. So we're going to just dump massive amounts of dollars into that industry so it's ours. The way the Chinese bought solar panels. Chinese have 90% of the solar panel market. Almost every important innovation that happened in solar came out of this country. and it was funded by US tax dollars. So there's a built here, there's an invented here, built there phenomenon. And there's also this anti-government sentiment here that's keeping us from responding to what the Chinese are doing. That innovation has to happen on a local level. We don't want to pick industries, we want to pick winners because we're a free market economy. Well, what's happening as a result of that to us is that it's being picked for us. Whatever scraps other countries want to leave behind, whether it's solar, whether it's semiconductors, whether it's consumer electronics, other countries are saying that's where we're going to dominate and we're going to fund it. And America's just left out to dry because you have private companies trying to compete against states, entire countries. How do they get away with it? They get away with it because it's a difference between a short-term mentality and a long-term mentality. If I'm the CEO of a publicly traded American company, my interests are aligned to the short-term performance of that company. My stock options are aligned with what I'm going to do in the next 2 years or 5 years. That means it's worth my time. It's worth it for me to go to China, cut a deal with them so I can squeeze out 3% more margin for the next 2 years, even if that means I'm ceding the entire industry back to them in several years. And I think that that's a story we're going to learn here one day about Apple. There are components in the iPad and the iPhone and all these things that Apple literally does not have the ability to manufacture. They say they're competing against Samsung, and Samsung delivers many of the components that go into their devices. I mean, I don't know about you, but for me, that does not sound like a long-term winning strategy, right? I don't buy Apple as much as I love Apple products, and this is with all due respect to Economidis, I love the branding. But I don't buy them because even though it's technically an American company, if you notice they say it's designed in California, it's all primarily built by Foxconn, and there's a little bit built in other places. Every time you buy a product from Apple, you add to the American trade deficit, okay? Which is why I don't buy it because my children live here and I'm not interested in expediting the demise of the country that my children will live in, okay? So that's my little piece about China and Asia and the global significance of innovation.